So I do most of my gaming on Linux. There's a couple of exceptions, like games that are only available on the PS4. I'll play it on PS4. I know this is on PC now, but when I got it, it wasn't. And I do want to get a Switch at some point to play some Switch-specific games, but most of the time, I'm just going to play it on Linux if I can do so. Sure, some games won't work perfectly. Maybe they'll have some performance issues which don't give you the most optimal experience, but it's still enough to actually play the game. Maybe some games require a bit of tweaking, let's say messing with different Proton options and different Proton versions. For example, with Ender Lilies, it started to crash with a very specific version of Proton GE, but if I don't use Proton GE, then the cutscenes don't play. But if I swap to a different version, it will work perfectly fine. And sure, some games flat out don't work at all. Things like Apex Legends and other games that have these really heavy anti-cheat that don't work nicely inside of Proton. But I'm happy to avoid games like that and just play all of the other games I want to play that work perfectly fine. Since Windows 8 and the introduction of the Microsoft App Store, Valve and Gabe Newell have seen Linux as the future of gaming. You can go back to talks back in 2012-2013 where Gabe Newell went to Linux conventions and talked about what he saw as this future. This did lead to the Steam machines, which were a colossal failure. They only had about 198 supported titles, because Proton didn't exist at the time, and a lot of these titles were indie games. There was nothing major to actually draw people to the platform. But with Proton, this has massively changed. According to ProtonDB, 76% of the top 1,000 games on Steam work perfectly fine under Proton. This includes really big games like the Fallout franchise, the Elder Scrolls franchise, the new Doom games, a bunch of random JRPGs. Most games that you want to play are probably going to work fine under Proton. And one thing that'll make Proton get way, way better, and just Linux gaming in general, is seeing the Steam Deck actually succeed. I think that if the Steam Deck succeeds, what we see is a console that actually applies pressure to game developers to get them to actually make their games work well under Proton. I don't think we're going to see a point where game developers are just openly shipping Linux native binaries, and I don't think it really matters. If they make it so their games actually work well under Proton and consider that to be a very important goal, I think at the end of the day, everyone still wins. And one of the biggest hurdles that does face Linux gaming is anti-cheat and DRM. I don't think either of these is ever going to go away. We can argue about the usefulness of DRM, but I think it's here to stay, and that's basically how it is. If you can support developers who don't use DRM or use platforms that don't have DRM enabled like GOG, but it's here to stay, so we sort of have to live with it. Now, Valve has said they are going to be working with BattlEye and EAC to make these things actually work well inside of Proton. These are two of the most common ways to do anti-cheat in a multiplayer game. They do say this is going to be available at launch, so my guess is they've been working on this for a couple of months prior, and they've got it aligned with the launch date because that's when they think it's actually going to be done. I really, really do hope that if it's not done by launch, they actually do delay the release of the console. Otherwise, if people try to play a competitive game on that, it's just not going to work, and it'll be a commercial failure. I say that because the reason why there are any games in the top 10 list on Steam that don't work under Proton is entirely because of anti-cheat. It's things like Apex Legends, PlayerUnknown Battleground, things like that. That's a big problem. These games are going to be games people actually want to play on their system. Now, not all anti-cheat does break on Linux or under Proton. For example, you can play Dota 2 perfectly fine on Linux because it has a native binary, and Valve cares about having their stuff work well on Linux, so their anti-cheat plays perfectly fine with it. There isn't a word on DRM support, but I find it very hard to believe they're not working on this as well. I don't think that supporting these things is going to bring people over to Linux, but by supporting these, it is going to make the situation considerably better for people who are already using this system. Now, Proton is just a translation layer, and how well it works depends on the features the developers are trying to make use of in their games and how much they actually consider Proton even being a thing that exists. Now, a lot of indie developers do actually make their games with Proton in mind and actually make their games work well on Proton. But most games out there just happen to work on Proton because Proton works well, not because the developers decided to intentionally support it. So I've had varying quality from game to game. While most things work fine, there have been some things that affect my quality of life. Things like, say, in Tyler Tasmanian Tiger, I've had random textures not loading, so I had like a waterfall where the waterfall text didn't load, so it was just a giant pink wall. Or I've had cutscenes with the video and the audio desync and the video jumps around a bit. It's fine, you can watch the cutscene or you can just skip it and the gameplay works fine. I've had random crashes and other little things like that. The crashes are really the only one that's actually a big deal. I don't really care about developers targeting Linux native gaming. I don't think this is ever going to be something that happens at a widespread level. But targeting Proton is basically the same as targeting a subset of Windows that is easy to translate. Sure, maybe there are some things you want to make use of that don't play nicely inside of Proton, but you want to have there for the Windows users. But if you keep Proton in mind, this is going to lead to a better experience. When it comes to game stores outside of Steam, the typical way to work with them is by using Lutris. So Lutris is basically a way to easily configure Wine and download pre-configurations for games, just make stuff work a little bit easier. Effectively working with Proton, but with extra steps. The reason why you have to do this is most of the time, they don't have a Linux native binary, so that's the first problem, you're actually getting the game launcher to actually work. And then the second reason is if they do have a Linux native binary, they probably don't have an integrated way, like with Proton, to actually run those Windows binaries. And this might just be me being hopeful, but what I would like to see come from the Steam Deck being a massive success is native clients for all of the game stores. That would be the first thing, and have them integrate something like Proton or Wine into their clients, and make it basically as seamless of an experience as using Steam. I want to just be able to go into the Epic Game Store, buy a game, run it with Proton, and if it doesn't work, I can swap out a different version of Proton, I can change around some settings, and basically just have an easier experience. Most game development, obviously being done on Windows, is being done with DirectX in mind. The problem with DirectX, though, is firstly, it's proprietary, secondly, it only works on Windows. Now, obviously, because of how well Proton works, Proton can handle DirectX perfectly fine, but there's another graphics API that doesn't have this problem, and that is Vulkan. A few years ago, Vulkan didn't really matter. If you weren't using DirectX or you had a second API, that was going to be OpenGL. And OpenGL is supported on Linux, but Vulkan is basically going to be faster. It is a much lower level API and gives you much more control. And Vulkan is supported in basically every major game engine, so enabling it isn't really that difficult. And this is supported on some really large platforms, things like the Switch, Stadia, obviously Windows and Linux. And if you want to go and use it on macOS, macOS currently only supports Molten, but there is a thing called Molten VK, which is basically a translation layer between the two APIs. Now, Valve does suggest targeting Vulkan if you want your game to work well on the Steam Deck. So Vulkan working on Linux obviously means less translation and less overhead, so more performance to actually be used on the game itself. And Vulkan also does tend to lead to less power consumption, which might not seem like a big deal if you're running a desktop system, but at the end of the day, you do have to pay your electricity bill, so bringing that bill down just a little bit if you're a very heavy gamer could be a nice side benefit. Controller support for most games that say they have it has worked perfectly fine. I've run into a couple of games, though, where there have been some massive issues that only exist with Proton. For example, I try to play with my Xbox controller in Ys 8, and my thumbsticks don't work. I try to play with my PS4 control, and my trigger buttons don't work. So that's a big problem. I literally cannot play the game with my controller. I've had to play it with keyboard and mouse, which isn't great for an action RPG. These are the sort of problems that having a controller attached to a system that runs Proton should hopefully get addressed. If you want your game to work well on the Steam Deck and you want it to have controller support, that's something you at least need to consider. I've got one last point, which isn't specific to Linux gaming, but sort of everyone on PC. Games are getting way too large. It is very common to see games that are over 75 gigabytes, and there's a couple of them out there which are over 200. That is insane. Even just 75 gig is more than the storage on the base model of the Steam Deck. And why would you bother compressing your game? Storage is getting really, really cheap, so just buy another hard drive, buy a 4, buy a 5, buy a 10 terabyte hard drive just to put your games on it. But even though the Steam Deck does have expandable storage, I can't imagine most people buying a micro SD card above like maybe a terabyte. Most people would probably go with like 512 gig, and those are about 85 USD. I want to see the Steam Deck make game developers consider that their game might be run on a system that has a very limited amount of storage, because it wasn't that long ago where having the game very compressed was a perfectly normal thing. Then we got Blu-ray discs and, well, basically have infinite storage for the game now. Let's just make the games as big as we want. And then the shift to digital makes it even worse. Let's just release a terabyte game. Why not? There's no reason not to. Handheld gaming PCs are still a relatively new form factor, and I don't know how they're going to mature into the future, but I certainly will be keeping an eye on them. I want to see Valve continue pushing Linux gaming, and hopefully one day it gets to the point where choosing the operating system you want to use doesn't even have gaming as one of the considerations. No one considers their web browser when deciding what operating system to use. They know it's already going to work. Only time will tell if the Steam Deck will actually succeed. But if anyone has the money to set the groundwork to make the Steam Deck succeed, Valve is the company that does. That's going to be it for me, and before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim Donald, Logan Michael, Andrew Mitchell Nathan, David Carl Will, Brennan, Chica Bento, Jamie Joseph Josh, Michael, Peter D. Stephen T. through Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to support work, the links down below to my Patreon, subscribe, start, leave a pay, that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brody Robson Plays, where I live stream twice a week and upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts. And this channel is also available over on Odyssey. So that's it for me, and I'm out.